It was a quiet evening when the strangers first arrived in the town. The air, thick with the scent of pine and decay, hung still as the three of them drove through the narrow streets. The town seemed deserted, its inhabitants having retreated into their homes, curtains drawn, eyes closed. The kind of place where secrets fester in the shadows, hidden in plain sight, where the wind whispers of things unspeakable. As they drove deeper into the heart of the town, the remnants of once proud houses now stood in various stages of collapse. Shutters hung loosely, some windows cracked, others completely shattered. The gas lamps flickered eerily in the fading light, casting long, unnatural shadows across the cracked cobblestone streets. The strangers were investigators, hired to uncover the truth of an ancient family that had vanished from the town's records. A family that, according to local folklore, had a history of unnatural births, grotesque deformities, and disturbing disappearances. There were whispers of a curse that plagued them, a curse so terrifying that no one dared speak its name aloud. They arrived at the mansion at the edge of the town as the last light of day disappeared behind the dense trees. The building was a towering silhouette, windows dark and vacant, like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. The gate creaked ominously as they pushed it open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. No sooner had they set foot on the overgrown grounds when a chill swept through the air, a coldness that seeped into their bones and made the hairs on their necks stand on end. There was something wrong with this place, something ancient, something that had been lying dormant for far too long. As they approached the front door, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, almost as if warning them to turn back. But they did not. They entered, and with each step deeper into the mansion, the silence grew more oppressive. The air smelled of dust, old wood, and something else, something metallic, like the faintest hint of blood. They began to search the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Portraits of the family lined the walls, deformed, twisted faces with eyes that seemed to follow them. The deeper they went into the house, the more they felt the weight of something watching them. Something was alive in the house, something that had not been disturbed in years. In the attic, they found a journal, its pages yellowed with age. It belonged to the last known member of the family, the man with 7 fingers and no tongue. The journal was filled with cryptic entries, some written in a strange, twisted script, others smudged with what appeared to be blood. The further they read, the more they realized the horrors that had plagued this family. They were not mere superstitions or old wives' tales. The curse was real. As the strangers uncovered the first pieces of the puzzle, they knew they had made a grave mistake. They had awoken something that had long been dormant, something that was far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. The wind howled louder outside, and the mansion seemed to come alive with it. The first scream echoed from somewhere deep within the house, but by then, it was too late. The night was unnaturally still as the strangers huddled together in the mansion's dimly lit library. The old journal they had found lay open before them, its yellowed pages revealing fragments of a history far darker than they had anticipated. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten time, but what lingered most heavily was the sense that they were no longer alone. Something unseen moved just beyond the edges of their perception, watching them, waiting. They flipped through the pages, the words becoming more disturbing with each entry. The family's history was marred by disturbing patterns, unexplained deaths, unexplained births, and strange mutations. It was not just the deformities that horrified, but the twisted nature of the family's legacy, stretching back generations. Each member had left their mark on the world, not by their deeds, but by the dark, disturbing marks on their flesh. One passage stood out, written in an unsteady, frantic hand. "He came to be not as we hoped, but as the blood demanded. The fingers, the tongue cursed. Born from the sin we committed, the curse lives through him." The strangers exchanged uneasy glances. It was the first mention of the man with 7 fingers and no tongue. Who was he? What had he become? They knew they had to uncover the truth, but the answers were growing more elusive with every page they turned. The mansion felt alive in a way that unsettled them to their very core. Footsteps echoed in the halls when no one was there. The wind rattled the windows. And strange, almost imperceptible sounds like whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves. The deeper they dug, the more they felt the mansion's grip tightening, pulling them into its cursed past. The journal spoke of the family's patriarch, a man who had begun the long, twisted history of inbreeding that would plague the family for generations. He had believed, wrongly, that he could break a family curse by keeping the bloodline pure by keeping it within the family. But all he had done was condemn his descendants to a life of suffering and deformity. As they read, they learned more about the inbred man, the product of generations of genetic decay. He had been born to the last living member of the family, a woman who had long since disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The journal's entries hinted at the man's existence, describing his grotesque features in unsettling detail. He had been hidden away, kept in the shadows, far from the town's prying eyes. And yet, the town seemed to feel his presence. His existence was known by all, feared by all, but never spoken of. The visitors could feel a cold weight on their hearts as they pieced together the family's horrifying history, the deformities, the strange birthmarks, the unspoken evil that had festered for so long it was all tied to a bloodline that should have ended long ago. The man with 7 fingers and no tongue was not just a result of this twisted legacy. He was the legacy itself. Suddenly, one of the visitors, the one holding the journal, let out a strangled gasp. His finger traced a new set of words that had not been visible before. The curse will end only when the blood is spilled. When the last of them returns to the earth, only then will the torment cease. The room fell silent. The air around them seemed to grow heavier. The wind outside picked up again, the trees groaning under the force of it. As the strangers sat there, they realized that they were not just discovering a dark family history, they were becoming part of it. And in that realization, they felt an icy dread creep into their bones. The curse was not just a story, it was real, and it was coming for them. The mansion felt colder now, as though the very walls had absorbed the suffering of generations past. Each step the strangers took echoed in the eerie silence, their footsteps seeming to reverberate through time itself. They could feel the weight of history bearing down on them, as though they were trespassing on forbidden ground. But the more they discovered, the more they realized they had no choice but to continue. The truth, as horrific as it was, had already begun to take hold of them. The journal, which had now become their only source of guidance, spoke of the family's origins, a history that predated even the town itself. In the early 1800s, the family had arrived in the area, establishing themselves as wealthy landowners. They had built the mansion they now found themselves in, and for a time, they had lived in relative peace. But that peace was shattered when the first signs of the curse began to manifest. Children born with deformities, strange illnesses that no doctor could explain, and a growing sense of paranoia that plagued the family's every move. By the mid-1800s, the patriarch had begun to take desperate measures to purify the bloodline. He turned to inbreeding, believing that by keeping the blood within the family, he could control the curse, but all he succeeded in doing was cementing the family's fate. The deformities became more pronounced, the psychological instability more severe, and the supernatural occurrences more frequent. The curse, it seemed, was not just physical, it was spiritual, a malevolent force that clung to the family like a dark cloud. As the strangers read the journal's final entries, they began to understand the true nature of the curse. It was not just a consequence of genetic deformities, it was a malevolent force that had taken root in the family's very blood. The more the family tried to preserve their bloodline, the stronger the curse became. The inbred man, the one with 7 fingers and no tongue, was not merely a victim of this twisted legacy, he was the living embodiment of it. His very existence was a manifestation of the family's sins, and as such, he had become a source of unimaginable power. The town had long known of the family's strange ways, but no one dared speak of it. Whispers of the family's bloodline circulated in hushed tones, but anyone who ventured too close to the mansion never returned. The few who did were never the same. They spoke of strange dreams, of being haunted by figures with twisted faces, and of hearing whispers in the night that told them to leave. The town had learned to stay away, to avoid the family's estate at all costs. But now, the strangers were here, unraveling the very threads of this cursed legacy. And as they read the final pages of the journal, they realized that they had only scratched the surface of a far darker truth. The curse was not contained within the family alone, it had spread throughout the town, infecting everything it touched. The bloodline had tainted the very soil, and anyone who lived in the town was, in some way, complicit in its horrors. The town itself had become a prison, and the curse had been woven into its very foundation. But what could they do now? The visitors had already dug too deep. They had awakened something that had been slumbering for decades, something that would not let them leave until it had consumed them completely. As they stood there, contemplating the enormity of what they had uncovered, the temperature in the room dropped even further. The air grew thick with a suffocating heaviness, and the walls seemed to close in around them. A low, guttural sound echoed from the darkness of the mansion, a sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The inbred man, whose existence had once been shrouded in mystery, was no longer just a legend. He was real, and he was waiting for them. As the mansion's air grew heavier and the temperature continued to drop, the strangers realized they had come too far to turn back. The journal had provided them with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain: they were no longer dealing with just a family's horrific history. The very nature of the deformities, the grotesque mutations, was linked to something far darker than simple genetic abnormalities. The curse itself, they now understood, had twisted and malformed not just the bodies, but also the very souls of its victims. The inbred man, the object of their investigation, had long been a subject of both fear and fascination for the townsfolk. His deformities were not merely physical, they were unnatural, disturbing. 7 fingers on each hand, a mouth that could never speak. His very body had become a canvas for the curse's malicious design, and his silent existence seemed to be the source of the town's unease. Yet, as they uncovered more, the strangers realized that the curse had taken hold in ways they could not have anticipated. One night, while exploring the mansion's old medical room where the town's first doctors had once treated patients, they uncovered something that made their blood run cold. In the far corner of the room, hidden behind a dusty curtain, was a cabinet filled with old medical equipment. They found a collection of strange diagrams, depicting the human body with grotesque alterations, multiple sets of hands, tongues twisted beyond recognition, and faces that seemed to melt into one another. These were not the works of any ordinary physician. These were experiments, dark rituals masquerading as science. It became clear that the patriarch, desperate to preserve the family's bloodline, had resorted to far more than simple incest. He had sought the help of twisted doctors and occultists, trying to break the curse using forbidden rituals, blood sacrifices, and unnatural experiments. But the more he meddled with the human form, the more monstrous his family became. The inbred man was the culmination of these experiments, a living testament to the patriarch's belief that purity could only be achieved through unspeakable means. The deeper the strangers ventured into the mansion's dark corners, the more they uncovered old, stained surgical instruments, jars filled with grotesque body parts, and journals describing disturbing rituals performed in the dead of night. These were not the actions of a man seeking to help his family. They were the actions of someone desperate to control something beyond human comprehension, something ancient and evil. As they sifted through the chaos, they discovered one final, horrific truth. The inbred man's deformities were not just a product of inbreeding, they were the direct result of the rituals performed by the patriarch. The rituals had altered the very fabric of his DNA, fusing his blood with something else, something that had never been meant to exist in the human form. One of the strangers, trembling, spoke the words aloud that they had all been thinking: he's not just a man, he's a monster, created by the very hands of his family. And with that realization, they understood that the inbred man was not merely a victim of a cursed bloodline, he was its avatar. His grotesque form was the physical manifestation of a curse that had twisted his entire family for generations. But as the strangers pondered this terrifying truth, they also realized something far worse. The curse was not finished with them. It had just begun. The mansion, with its decaying walls and foul air, was not just a home. It was a tomb, a prison, and a breeding ground for something darker still. A low growl reverberated through the halls, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of something moving. The visitors froze. They knew, without a doubt, that the inbred man was not the only horror that lurked in the darkness of this mansion. The curse had festered for too long, and now it was coming for them. The tension in the air grew unbearable as the visitors huddled together, their eyes darting nervously around the room. The growl, low and guttural, echoed through the mansion's vast halls, sending shivers down their spines. The mansion itself seemed to breathe with a life of its own, its creaking walls and floorboards adding to the growing sense of dread. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. Every whisper in the wind felt like a warning. As they made their way deeper into the mansion, the strangers began to realize the full extent of the curse. It wasn't just confined to the family or the mansion, it had spread, infiltrating everything: the house, the town. The very land itself had become tainted. The curse had seeped into the earth, and now it was an unstoppable force, twisting and warping everything it touched. The visitors had already begun to piece together the horrifying truth about the inbred man, but now they were faced with a far darker question. Could they escape? Could they undo what had been done? Or were they doomed to become just another tragic chapter in the mansion's long, twisted history? They made their way to the heart of the mansion, the basement, where they hoped to find the answers they so desperately sought. The air grew thick with the scent of decay and blood as they descended the creaky stairs, the dim light from their flashlights flickering in the damp, oppressive darkness. The basement was far colder than the rest of the house, the walls covered in a layer of mildew and the floor slick with a film of moisture. But it was the center of the room that drew their attention: a large, ritualistic circle carved into the stone floor, surrounded by strange symbols and remnants of old, charred offerings. Here, in this cold, forgotten space, the true nature of the curse had been born. The patriarch had not just sought to purify the bloodline, he had sought to bind it to something darker, something that had existed long before his time. He had summoned ancient forces, forces that should have never been disturbed. The inbred man, with his 7 fingers and lack of a tongue, was not just a victim of his bloodline, he was the vessel through which the curse had taken root. As they examined the ritualistic symbols, a horrifying realization dawned on them. The curse was not just a consequence of the family's twisted past. It was a living entity, a malevolent force that had taken root in the bloodline and could only be stopped by one thing: blood. The blood of the inbred man. But how could they possibly defeat something so ancient, so powerful? The curse had already claimed the town, and it seemed to have a hold on the very fabric of reality. The walls felt as if they were closing in, and every breath they took seemed to choke them, thick with the stench of death. It was then that they heard it, a soft, slow shuffling sound coming from the shadows. The inbred man, the cursed embodiment of the bloodline, stood in the doorway. His twisted, malformed body was barely visible in the dim light, his eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. His fingers, each grotesquely long and pointed, twitched as he stepped forward. The visitors froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could feel the weight of the curse bearing down on them, could feel the malevolent presence of the inbred man as he approached. There was no escape now. The inbred man's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged, only a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. He was the embodiment of the curse itself, a creature born of blood and darkness, and he would stop at nothing to ensure that his twisted legacy continued. The strangers, realizing they had only one choice left, moved to confront him, but their bodies felt heavy, as if the very air around them was pressing them down. The curse had them in its grip, and no amount of willpower could free them from its grasp. As they reached for the symbols on the floor, attempting to complete the ritual that might break the curse, the inbred man lunged forward, his fingers curling into grotesque claws. The air crackled with an electric charge, and the room seemed to distort as the curse fought back. It was as if the mansion itself had become alive, fighting to protect the secret it had long kept hidden. With one final, desperate push, the visitors managed to complete the ritual, their hands shaking as they etched the final mark into the stone. The ground trembled beneath them, and a deafening silence followed. The inbred man paused, his eyes narrowing, as if he sensed something changing. His body shuddered violently, and then, with a final, piercing scream, he crumbled to the ground. His form began to twist and distort, as if the very essence of his existence was being torn apart. But as the inbred man fell, a strange calm descended over the mansion. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the air growing warmer, lighter. For a moment, the strangers thought they had succeeded, thought they had broken the curse. But as the echoes of the inbred man's screams faded into the distance, they realized they had only won a temporary victory. The curse would not be so easily vanquished. It would live on in the mansion's walls, in the blood of the town's residents, and in the twisted history that would forever haunt them. The mansion stood still, as if holding its breath, after the inbred man's final scream had faded into the oppressive silence. The strangers, their hearts racing, dared not move for a moment. The ritual had been completed, or so they thought. The air no longer hummed with an ominous presence, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. The mansion, once full of life and malevolent energy, now felt like a tomb, empty, silent, yet inexplicably full of meaning. Slowly, the visitors began to move again, their eyes darting to the crumpled form of the inbred man. His body, once so twisted and grotesque, now lay motionless, his fingers still extended in an unnatural position. There was no blood, no indication of death. The air around him felt colder, but also emptier, as if the curse itself had gone dormant, waiting. They were wrong to think the curse was over. What they had done, completing the ritual, had only weakened it. The truth was far more chilling than they could have imagined. The curse had never been something that could simply be destroyed. It wasn't a thing, a force that could be banished. It was woven into the very fabric of the world around them, tied not just to the bloodline, but to the land itself. The ritual, rather than cleansing the curse, had only triggered its final phase. The visitors gathered around the inbred man's body, their breaths shallow. As the ground beneath them began to rumble, the walls of the mansion, once still and silent, began to groan with a life of their own. The temperature dropped, and they could see their breath forming mist in the air. The curse was changing, evolving. The time for the family's sins to be reckoned had come. Suddenly, a figure stepped forward from the shadows, one that had not been present before. The figure was tall, shrouded in darkness, and as it stepped into the dim light, the strangers realized it wasn't a figure at all. It was an entity, a manifestation of everything the family had ever done. This was no ghost. This was no simple apparition. The being that now stood before them was the embodiment of the curse itself, the patriarch's spirit, twisted and contorted by his own malice. His face, a mass of shifting shadows and grotesque features, grinned at them with a terrible understanding. "You think you can escape?" the figure whispered, its voice a cacophony of voices. "But the bloodline does not end. It cannot." The strangers tried to speak, to protest, but their words caught in their throats, as if the air itself was thickening, choking them. The figure reached out, its hand a mass of writhing tendrils, and the very air seemed to crackle with energy as it neared them. "You should have never come here," the figure continued, its smile widening impossibly. "You have awakened the curse that sleeps within us all, and now it is too late." With one last, deafening scream, the figure lunged forward, but as it did, everything went dark. The strangers awoke later, sprawled on the cold stone floor of the mansion's basement. The temperature had returned to normal, and the oppressive weight that had filled the air seemed to have lifted. For a moment, they thought they had escaped, but as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they realized something far worse had occurred. The inbred man's body was gone. The mansion had returned to its decaying state, but it felt different now, more alive, more aware. The curse had not been destroyed. It had been passed on, absorbed into something far darker. The strangers, though alive, could feel the stain of the bloodline in their own veins. It was as though the mansion itself had claimed them. And now, they were forever tied to its cursed history. One of the strangers, trembling, whispered in the darkness, "We've become part of it." And in that moment, the mansion seemed to groan once more, as if in agreement. The curse would never end. It was eternal, a sickness that had spread beyond the family, beyond the mansion, and now, beyond even time itself. The bloodline was no longer contained to the family. It was a plague, a force that could not be purged. The visitors left the mansion, but the town would never be the same. The dark history of the Bloodline had woven itself into the fabric of the world, and the curse would continue, living on in those who had uncovered it, forever entwined with the darkness that had once festered within the mansion's walls. As they left the gates of the estate, one last, chilling thought crossed their minds: the curse was still out there, waiting for the next unwitting soul to stumble upon its horrifying truths. And so, it would continue eternally. The curse of the Bloodline had always been far more than just the twisted legacy of a family. It was a living, breathing entity, an ancient malevolence tied to the very land upon which the mansion stood. The mansion itself, with its decaying walls and haunted halls, had become the cradle of this curse, a curse born from years of inbreeding, dark rituals, and twisted attempts to control something that was never meant to be controlled. The strangers who came seeking answers were not mere victims of curiosity. They were drawn to the mansion by the same darkness that had cursed the family, and in doing so, they unwittingly sealed their own fate. The ritual they performed, intended to break the curse, only served to awaken it from its slumber, transforming it into something even more insidious. The inbred man, once thought to be the curse's most horrifying manifestation, was only a symbol, a living embodiment of the family's sins, but the true horror was far greater. The curse had spread beyond the family, beyond the mansion. It had taken root in the land itself, in the town, and in the very hearts of those who dared to uncover its secrets. The mansion stands still, its walls holding the echoes of the past, waiting. The curse will never end. It will live on in the shadows, in the whispers of the wind, in the blood of those who unknowingly carry its legacy. And so, the story concludes, but the curse remains forever.